Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Imaginaries podcast. I'm a magical portrait of a magical portrait artist of a magical portrait of a magical portrait artist all the way down until existential infinity. Tony.
Hello, I'm the underwhelming sexy / fanfic fever dream that you're too ashamed to share with your therapist and too embarrassed to share even after 4 beers with your friends. Cheers!
Cheers! It also makes it sound like your name is Cheers, which I'm cool with.
My name is not Cheers. My name is Kent. Sorry.
Wow,
I should have announced that.
That's cool. I'm going to call you Cheers for this podcast.
Cheers!
Which is all about the legacy of the Harry Potter series.
Woo woo.
So we are, as opposed to most of our podcasts, where I'm like, let's define it. Which is a good place to start most of the time.
We're going to assume that you know what Harry Potter is.
We're going to assume that you've heard of him, once or twice.
Yeah.
Right. And we're going to start off this time, I think, with our first exposures to Harry Potter. So let's start there. What was yours? Where did you first come to the Boy Wizard?
So I remember my senior year of high school, which of course in Australia is not called your senior year, it's called year 12. I remember people were walking around wearing spoiler t-shirts on the one day of the year when we were allowed to wear non-uniform clothes. Huh. And they were wearing like the Dumbledore is dead t-shirts. And people were super fucking angry. And I did not get it. I did not know that Dumbledore was a character in Harry Potter. Sorry, everyone who's listening. That probably deserved a spoiler alert.
It was over 10 years ago now. Go on.
This is a book. This is a series you should have read or watched by now. So hopefully that was not a spoiler. However, I apologize anyway on principle. So anyway, people were walking around with these t-shirts, and I remember going, I wonder what that's about. And then I graduated, and we came back to the States, and since the Australian school year finishes in, like, November, December, and the American college year doesn't begin until, August, I had 8-9 months to burn, and I was working and living on a corn farm / horse ranch in northeastern Colorado, and I had a lot of time on my hands, bro. So I sat down and I read Harry Potter start to finish. And it was a great experience. I'm not going to lie. Like, that was kind of an ideal way to read Harry Potter with all of them out at once. I mean, maybe not the only ideal way, but ideal for me. It was great. And then after that, I remember I must have been, once I started college, some of my friends liked it well enough that they did a Harry Potter marathon, and I actually saw the movies then too. So it was pretty close together. It was not as they came out. It was after all of the books were out. Yeah, but I wouldn't say that I was like the ideal fan. I never really was around when the fan culture was building itself. I like Harry Potter a lot, but I wasn't, it wasn't a part of my childhood the way that it was a part of a lot of our generation's childhood.
Right.
So how about you? What was your experience?
Well, it actually, funnily enough, also began in Colorado, given that neither of us live there now or have lived there for many years.
Yay, Colorado.
But it was when I was in late elementary or middle school. That's right. Late elementary or middle school. I was like 5th grade, 6th grade, maybe.
Yeah, 97, I think, is when the first one came out.
Yeah, and I didn't read it then. But it was somewhere in like the 98, 99, maybe early 2000 window. Because the first book was out, the second book was out, and my mom read about it in one of those Book of the Month clubs, and it came as, highly recommended. So she told me I should read it, because I was really into, at that point, like Lynn Reed Banks and L. Frank Baum of the Oz series and the Freddie the Pig series. So I was very much like in this fairly large, like the books themselves are fairly large, like they're chapter books. They're like, what we might call now like juvenile fiction. What did you call it last week?
Yeah, junior fiction.
Junior fiction.
Middle grade fiction, both.
Right. And like YA wasn't really a thing that you heard about. Like that wasn't really a label yet. But it seemed like the first Harry Potter book was correct. And then I and my friend Verena, who, if she is ever going to listen to this podcast. Shout out, because she's also an awesome librarian now.
Yay, shout out.
But we got really into the first 2 books, and then I actually found the 3rd book in a Sam's Club in Pueblo, Colorado, and got that, and I actually read that before the 2nd book. I read the first book, then the 3rd book, then the 2nd book, because number 3 had just come out, and Sam's Club was stocking them because I guess it was a big enough deal at that point that it was there. And then from then on, I was a fan. But that was kind of in the days where, like, you know, at least for me, I was a friend. I was a fan with my friends. Like, the internet wasn't really a part of my fandom yet. And then, like, around the 4th book, it was. Like, I remember when I found MuggleNet, for example, and that was, like, a big deal. But in terms of, you know, the phenomenon that it would become, like, I dressed up as Harry Potter for Halloween when the 3rd book was out, and I wore, like, a red towel as a cloak, and I had the glasses, and I had the scar, and no one knew who I was. Like, kind of, just think about that for a second. Like, we went trick-or-treating. I must have been, again, in, like, the 5th or 6th grade, so I was fairly old, but both my brothers were younger, and not one person granted, very small Colorado town, but not one person knew who Harry Potter was. So...
This being the 20th anniversary of the first books, it's amazing to me that you still have kids dressing up as Harry Potter. I had a couple kids come into the library during trick-or-treating this year who were dressed up as Harry Potter. So it is such a changed world that we live in now, where Harry Potter is shorthand for so many things. It's the go-to, like, iconic image of fantasy for so many people. It's really... It is a changed world from back then in the late 1990s or early 2000s.
It is. And that's really what we want to talk about with this podcast. Like, what is this changed world? Like, we've had Harry Potter out there for just over 20 years now. How have things changed? Like, what is the ongoing legacy of Harry Potter? So I think actually one of the things that I talked about is a great place to start. We didn't really have YA. You know, that was not really a genre in the way that it is today. And you can certainly, you know, argue that things like, you know, I loved Animorphs at the same time. And obviously that was a powerhouse. Like, Goosebumps was a powerhouse in the 90s. Like, going back even before that, you had, like, the Babysitters Club, the Hardy Boys. Like, all of those were, you know, kind of aimed at the same reading level. But Harry Potter kind of was a different thing again. So maybe, what do you think of that? I feel like you have a better perspective on it as someone who, you know, works with kids and with books on a daily basis.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, and we'll probably get into this more as we go on, but I think one of the unusual and cool things that Harry Potter did is, as Rowling was writing these books, she matured the content, she matured her voice and style along with the characters. So by the time that people who entered the series and fell in love with the series exited the series in the final book, they were at the YA reading level. These days in our library, technically the series is split between junior fiction and YA based on the age of the characters and the content maturity level. And I think that that's a fair distinction, that, like, if you take the Philosopher's Stone and you take the Deathly Hallows, those are two very different books stylistically, in terms of voice, and in the ages of the characters, so they belong in different sections technically. So what ended up happening is Rowling, you know, she innovated or mobilized an entire generation of readers to enjoy a certain, like, level or voice or whatever you want to call it that now we would associate with YA. I don't know that she was, you know, new in doing that, but she certainly had the greatest reach that I can recall of any author operating around that time when YA was in its infancy stages. So I think she brought many readers into YA right when, you know, it was in its infancy. Maybe she even was the spark that caught the fire, you know. And then publishers paid attention to that. There was a market there, and all of a sudden you see libraries setting up young adult sections. You see bookstores giving over entire shelves to young adult books. It started small. I remember the first YA section I saw was just like, one, stack in the library. These days, it's a much bigger deal. And you have an entire generation of adults now, like 30-year-olds like us, who read down. And I hate that expression, but we read down as much as we read books that are specifically targeted to adults. So it's a thing. It's a powerhouse in the publishing world and the marketing world as much as it is a thing that we enjoy dabbling in.
And that kind of is an interesting observation as well that I didn't necessarily think of, that by establishing YA as something that, young people would buy, that their parents would buy for them, that they would then buy when they grew up and were potentially parents themselves, either for their kids or for themselves. Like, this was basically an entire untapped market, it feels like.
Yeah, and actually, if you think about it too, I mean, after like the 1980s or so on, around there, you saw a shift in publishing in the actual treatment of books. And you can see this clearly when you walk through a library. And if you're a library like ours marks when a book was put in its catalog, you can easily see when, what decade a book was added to the collection. Yeah. And in our library, there's this move away from hardcover books for young readers in the 80s. And then you had the 90s with like the Babysitter's Club and all of those popular fiction books that were mostly published in paperback. And you might have a limited run of hardback, but it was pretty limited. And, like Redwall is an example of that, where they had some hardcover, but Redwall was a big seller. But, I mean, Harry Potter changed the game. Harry Potter brought big, honkin' ass young adult and junior fiction books in hardcover back to the common bookshelf. Yeah. And that has been, I think, a great thing for the genre, the reading level, the readers themselves, because now you have these things that feel substantial, that feel more real. It also shows that, the publishing industry respects them a little bit more. They're willing to publish them in hardback. Right. Yeah. And so now we have like equal parts hardback and softcover in our younger, non-adult reading sections in the library, which I think is really cool. They last longer and you can read them more times.
Right. And there was this new kind of faith in continuity. Like, not only are these, giant hardback books suddenly on the shelves and suddenly flying off the shelves, but you have these people who over literally a decade basically sign up to buy at least 7 hardcover books in hard copy.
Yeah, which is, I mean, when you consider how big our allowances were at the time, I know books were cheaper when we were, teens, but still, that was a substantial output, to foot that bill.
Yeah, and I was in 97 when the first book came out. I was 10. I didn't come to it until I was 11 or 12, but going through a decade, then suddenly I'm in my early 20s when the final book comes out, and obviously I read it. Like, I still read the Harry Potter series back every once in a while, but that's kind of, for a lot of kids, they, we grew up with these books, and now, more generations get to do that, but that just seems kind of like, again, a sort of sea change in how episodic young people's fiction was treated. Like, you had Goosebumps again, the Babysitter's Club, the Hardy Boys, Encyclopedia Brown, and all of these. Yeah. Well, Animorphs is a separate case that I want to talk about in a second, but all those series that I just mentioned, you could pick them up wherever. Like, there was not really continuity there. With Animorphs, you had a progressing story, but say you read 1 through 10 and then dropped off for a while, and then picked up 25. You would still know what was going on. The characters were the same, things might have changed, but you get a recap in the first couple of chapters. In Harry Potter, if you read up through book 3, then missed 4, and tried to come back to 5, you would be lost. You couldn't do it. So, it necessitated that readers read them in order, read them all, read them totally, and then proceed on to the next one. And that's, again, sort of continuity over a decade. Seems like it was fairly unprecedented at that point.
It was influential in not just how books were published and treated by that sector, but by how authors crafted a tale for young readers.
Mm-hmm.
I think you saw a lot less of, I'm going to just go at it and say like Indian in the cupboard kind of level of writing and treatment of its young protagonists, and a lot more nuanced and sort of epic treatments of young people's feelings, which I think matched beautifully how I felt when I was a teen. I mean, my feelings were sharper. They were more grandiose. You know, my frontal lobe wasn't fully developed, so I didn't have as many inhibitions. So I think that what Rowling did was really kind of brilliant in tapping into the, like, grandness that's possible for young people to feel. She didn't write down to them. She didn't condescend. And I mean, there were other authors who were doing a great job, like Le Guin and so forth. But, you know, she kind of brought a lot of important things together, I think Rowling did.
Yeah, I agree. And that was, when I look back at what we would now call, like, junior fiction and YA, and even, like, children's fiction, like, what I think of as, like, chapter books when you're a kid, really the best ones and the ones that stick with me are the kind of books I can go back to now and remember thinking, like, wow, this book is treating me like an actual person. And I'm going back to Beverly Cleary is probably the first one. I remember with any clarity who did that.
Or like Judy Blume or someone like that.
So and that kind of realness was present in the Harry Potter books, and that seems kind of like a weird thing to say about a work that is so unabashedly fantastical, but at the heart it was really about these relationships and the feelings of these characters.
Absolutely.
So I would like to talk about some of the content legacies we see in Harry Potter, partially because I'm going in a direction with this, and that direction is that with something that is as big and as influential as Harry Potter, when I looked back at it, I was like, wow, there must be all of these, like, copycat works that I just am not familiar with. And it turns out there aren't. Like, there was not suddenly a boom in fantasies that dealt in, like, wizard schools. There was not a boom in, like, these YA series that dealt with hidden wizarding worlds. There was not really a boom in, like, everyone writing about the UK in this really Anglophilic way. There were certainly some examples. There was the Charlie Bone series. The author, I can't remember what her name was, but that was, like, pretty contemporaneous with Harry Potter. I think it started to come out at the same time. There was Rainbow Rowell's Carry On, which I just read. There was Lev Grossman's The Magicians, which was adapted. But you have this kind of, like, this constellation of works that deals, that you can kind of trace back directly to Harry Potter. But as far as getting a lot of that content similarity, like, it just didn't really exist. But once you start to sort of, like, widen your gaze a little bit and look at the emergence of YA and the juggernaut that it became, I think it helps to sort of, look at what did succeed and sort of see if we can trace that back to Harry Potter. So
right.
I'm going to turn this over to you in just a second, because I want you to tell me about the power of the YA dystopia.
Well, I noted in our notes that I actually really love this case study, this comparison of dystopia to Harry Potter, because I think Harry Potter mobilized young readers into, like, Dumbledore's army. And I mean, there's literally, like, this happens in the books, but also I remember as I started to grow aware of Harry Potter and its how important it was to many of my friends once I moved back to the States, I began to realize that, like, they really had been mobilized into some sort of coherent identity. They were all Harry Potter fans. Some of them actually wore, like, Dumbledore Army material, swag, etc. And I think why dystopias came into the fore, like, right about when readers who were weaned on Harry Potter would be looking for more older material, as we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But YA dystopias lean heavily on messages of righteous anger and social commentary and overthrowing the system.
Yeah.
When Harry Potter's not really doing that, I mean, at least the intent of it wasn't to do that. Its central message is, as everyone will probably remember, one of empathy and love and unity and reverence for systems, even when the people running the Ministry of Magic are complete assholes and possibly evil. There's an argument, I'm sure, to be made that Harry Potter also leans a little bit on righteous anger. Like, there's that scene in the movie where it's like, get your hands off my daughter, bitch! And everyone, I remember, was clapping and cheering when they heard that in the movie. So, like, there's a part of that, like, righteous anger that's there. But at least in terms of, like, the author's intent, I think that dystopias and Harry Potter come from very different angles. And we'll get into it a little bit further on, or perhaps I should just get into it now. That I once had a professor who told me that Mozart and Beethoven basically broke music. In that once they came along and did what everyone else had been doing well, but did it perfectly and so forcefully, that music was basically forced to change dramatically after that, because where do you go from perfection but like completely change the genre? You know, like you kind of have to skip the rails and go in a different direction if you're going to do anything new after someone like Mozart or Beethoven perfects the form. Well, I think Harry Potter kind of did the same thing. It wasn't new. I mean, Le Guin and a bunch of others had done young wizarding school books before. I mean, we've talked about Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea on the show before. Jill Murphy, Jane Yolen, T.H. White all had content and voice aspects that J.K. Rowling was building off of. In fact, I think J.K. Rowling has actually admitted to using T.H. White as like a spiritual ancestor of her books, you know. So in a sense, Harry Potter was the inheritor of a legacy of fantasy fiction, and it may have perfected the form to the point where do you go from here? Where do you go from this juggernaut of a book that has mobilized an entire generation of readers who are going to be sensitized and very sensitive to copycat works? I think you go in a completely different direction, and maybe that direction was the YA dystopia. And also, of course, the world kind of started to suck really bad around the same time.
Right, of course.
So maybe it just kind of, you know, was the perfect mix to have the dystopia take over.
I think
anyway, that's my theory.
I think that's a really fascinating theory. No, I want to hear you talk more about it. But you know, it just really struck me that when I think about where the readers of Harry Potter went afterwards, like it wasn't into, I don't know, there wasn't really a transition point where suddenly you had all of these readers who had been mobilized by Harry Potter going into, like, for example,
one book world.
Right, one book world, or like even, you didn't see a similar explosion of like fantasy titles for adults. Like you certainly have had, a healthy list of fantasy for adults, fantasy that is not tagged as junior fiction or YA since then, but there wasn't kind of the change over of like, here are the, tens of hundreds of millions of people who read Harry Potter and now they're reading this. Like, so where did they go? What was, and where did that
a bunch of
actually
different places,
go?
I think.
Right, in a bunch of different places. And I think that a lot of it was, like, you saw a lot of spillover into those YA dystopia worlds, and they were, the ones that really did well were things like The Hunger Games and help me out here.
Well, I was thinking too, in the fantasy sense, you had a lot of people move over to the Aragon books and so on and so forth, like dragon fantasy. You had a lot of, like high fantasy in YA, but it wasn't content-wise similar at all to Harry Potter. It was YA fantasy, sci-fi, but it wasn't remotely the same. Yeah. I think too, you had some readers who by that point were old enough that they were looking in the adult section for similar things, and they may not have found it, which may be why we see so much coming around now when our generation is old enough to be publishing, and a publishing market force. So, now that we're at this age, we're seeing pretty nuanced, mature, exciting fantasy. We're seeing also a diversification in subgenres, if you want to call them that, submodes, subcats in fantasy. You've got hybrid sci-fi fantasy forms. You've got Afrofuturism. You've got the rise of a bunch of different influences. And I think in part it's because the authorship has grown more diverse because a decade or so ago, readership became more, or the genres became more friendly to diverse readers who then would go on to be writers. You know? Like, I think that maybe we could connect the dots there, maybe.
Right. And I think that's an interesting way to segue into our next section, because one of the things that I wanted to grab is, I don't want to say it that way. One of the things I wanted to address in this podcast is the impact that Harry Potter has had on the academic world. And I'm not just talking about, being used as a series in like K through 12 education, which it is and which is great. But the actual academic works that have come out of universities where people use Harry Potter, analyze Harry Potter, where it becomes a part of like the science and the art of what goes on in university research. So I know that you pulled a couple of works from the humanities. I pulled a couple of works from the social sciences, but let's talk a little bit about the legacy of Harry Potter for people who maybe grew up with it and who now are, researchers. They're grown-up researchers. This is what they do for a living, and they've incorporated Harry Potter into that, their academic work. So, What did you find?
Well, when I went looking for material relating to Harry Potter on the academic search portal that I have access to, which is through the University of North Texas, there were over 600,000 results. So this is not like a minor field. It's basically Harry Potter could be its own academic field at this point. It's magical, to say the least, to go looking for material that has been written in the academic, peer-reviewed, scholarly world on the subject. So I did pull out a couple of my top hits to kind of reference. The first one relates to pop culture and fandom. I think that there's been an explosion in interest in how fandom works, how it relates to texts and to authors in the wake of Harry Potter. And part of this is due to the rise of like mega cults, like mega pop culture cults, like the Harry Potter fandom, the Hunger Games fandom, so on and so forth. Every TV show on Earth, like The Walking Dead, has its fandom now. And also in part due to the rise of social media. Yeah. So this text deals with that a little bit, and it's called Disappointing Fans, Fandom, Fictional Theory, and the Death of the Author, and it's by Goodman. It was published in 2015, and it talks about fanon discontinuity, which is when fans decide to reject additions to their favorite worlds because maybe this new thing doesn't line up with their ideas of what's acceptable for the canon. And this would relate to, but precedes the release of the new Harry Potter prequel series. But I think it has a lot of relevant points that you can apply to what's happened in the intervening years with the Harry Potter fandom, how people have reacted so strongly against the stage play and against the prequels and how they're getting it wrong. They also reacted, and Goodman pointed out how people treated the epilogue to the series, and they basically said, no, we're going to pretend that this didn't happen. I'm just going to move on. The article also talks about fantagonism, like antagonism, but fantagonism, which is like aggressive approaches by fans to their favorite texts, to the authors of those texts, and their desire to fix, quote unquote, what's happened in the original text, like Harry going with Ginny rather than going with Hermione. So I thought that this article was a really great summary of, some of the problematic or things that have been called problematic about fandom, I think that Goodman treats everyone pretty fairly and upholds some of the strengths of fandom and their desire to see good things in the world, as well as noting on maybe some of their problematic aspects. So that is the first article that I would pull out, but I want you to pull one out too. You were looking at social science. What would be one of the articles that you found when looking at social science?
So I don't want to go too in-depth into these simply because I don't know what they're talking about. But there are a couple of articles that I pulled from neuroscience journals. One of these is from the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. Another is from the journal Neuro Report. And they're looking at actual neural responses to reading Harry Potter. Some of these are looking at, for example, the one in the journal Neuro Report. The title is Fiction Feelings in Harry Potter, Hemodynamic Response in the Mid-Cingulate Cortex Correlates with Immersive Reading Experience. It's from 2014 and by the authors Shu, Conrad, and Jacobs. And they're actually, they're looking at the neuroscientific background for, or a neuroscientific explanation for that feeling of being immersed in a book. And they're using Harry Potter because it's a book that is easy to, a series that's easily to immerse into. And what I found interesting about the neuroscience studies, at least the two that I pulled, is that they treat Harry Potter in similar ways. It's kind of this stand-in for popular work that everyone has familiarity with, but is able to sort of exist apart from whoever's being studied. So I mentioned that last part because that's an integral component of the other study I pulled. Its title is I Know You Are, But What Am I? Neural Bases of Self and Social Knowledge Retrieval in Children and Adults. This is, again, from the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience in 2007. The authors are Pfeiffer, Lieberman, and DiPreto, and they're using Harry Potter as, quote, highly familiar other, against which their participants describe themselves, and while they were getting MRI testing. And again, I don't know a lot about neuroscience, so I guess it's kind of standard that you stick someone in an MRI and sort of see what's going on with their brain while they're doing different activities, whether that's reading Harry Potter or hearing about Harry Potter or something. But I thought it was really interesting that a lot of these studies aren't necessarily looking at what's going on in Harry Potter necessarily, but rather what's going on in your brain while you're reading Harry Potter or while you're being exposed to Harry Potter. So
did they connect it back at all to changes in the brain or changes in behavior, or was it mostly these are direct observations from while someone is reading?
I know that they were hypothesis driven studies. The one that I just read from the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience had a fairly small pool, 12 children and 12 adults. So it looks like that was more exploratory. The other one from Neuro Report, the hemodynamic response in the cortex and the immersive reading experience, it looks like their hypothesis there was that narratives with emotional contents invite readers more to be empathetic with the protagonists and thus engage the effective empathy network of the brain. So it looks like they were trying to say basically that when you read in this really involved way, the brain responds in a certain way, which may have similarities to other responses, other stimuli that you may encounter.
I think it's really fascinating how, the text that you've mentioned in the social science field, the neuroscience field, they really focus on the people reading the book and, chemically, physically what's happening in their bodies. Whereas, when you look at the humanities field, which is mostly where I pulled my text from, you see a lot more of content analysis and behavioral analysis. Readers pulling this out of a text.
Right.
And so on and so forth. So like two of the articles that I discovered, one deals with race in Harry Potter, one deals with queer readings of Harry Potter. So like the race article is by J.C. Horan in 2010, and it's titled Harry and the Other, Answering the Race Question in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. And it looks at racial inequality as portrayed in Harry Potter and what we can project of Rowling's intent in crafting the text in a certain way, with certain like call outs to how people out who've read the text have responded to the racial content. And she notes that she actually asks the closing question: will Rowling create a new series, one in which Harry, Hermione, and Ron's children struggle with the more difficult task of recognizing the claims of the goblins and the elves, and work collectively with these marginalized groups to change the power structures of their society? And I want to put a bookmark there because I want you to talk about that since you've watched the first one of the prequel movies. The second article that I read that was really interesting in terms of content analysis and connecting the dots from content to people's reaction was The Boy Who Lived in the Cupboard, Queer Readings and Rowling's Harry Potter series by Owindri Roy in 2017. So that's much more recent. And I think it reflects a resurgence of interest in kind of going back and revisiting these texts that maybe came out when conversations about queering fantasy and queering sci-fi were nascent. And now that now that we're more established, now that the conversation's going, people are going back and kind of seeing whether there were things to be discovered in these texts that were written and published before the conversation itself got started. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
The final article that I read that I wanted to mention was The Perils of Shapeshifting, Harry Potter and Christian Fundamentalism, which appeared in Pastoral Psychology in 2013, and it's written by Elle Simmons. And I think that this one's interesting because it connects back to, of course, like my heritage and the fact that I know that there's this alternate universe alongside our own in which people think that Harry Potter is demonic and satanic. And I think that it's an interesting one because it talks about how the controversy over Rowling's work, direct quote, is really another front in the identity wars, the struggle to inhibit, define, and restrict the flexibility of the self and the future of American identity. And I just loved all three of these texts and how they did their content analysis. I thought they were all really well put together and well thought through, but they're so different from the text that you were exploring. And I think that that's just fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. And I actually, so two things I want to do. First is I want to throw out one final text that sort of connects what you were pulling with what I was pulling. And then I want to return to that question you asked from the article Harry and the Other, because I think that'll bring us into the final portion of stuff that we want to talk about for this podcast, which is the rebirth of the franchise and sort of like where it goes from here. But the last work that I want to talk about that's appeared in an academic journal is from 2015. The title of the article is The Greatest Magic of Harry Potter, Reducing Prejudice, and it appeared in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology. And I actually went searching for this one because I remember reading about this article, I think it must have been when it came out, so a few years ago. It's by Vizali and several other authors, more than 4, so I won't list them. But this is a direct quote from their abstract. Quote, "We conducted 3 studies to test whether extended contact through reading the popular best-selling books of Harry Potter improves attitudes towards stigmatized groups." The 3 groups that they looked at were, again, quote, immigrants, homosexuals, and refugees. And essentially,
went there! That's
they
awesome!
Did. And what they found, essentially, is that, yes, there actually was this statistically significant connection between people who had read Harry Potter and their feelings towards these marginal groups that these psychologists were looking at. And so I think one of the reasons why I remember reading this back then is that this was a really cool finding, that these books that were so popular, that really strongly dealt with these issues of equity in societies, actually produced these measurable results, and the readers felt more kindly towards marginalized groups in our real life society. So there was this, like, now the scientific connection to be made between what was happening in the books and what the readers were doing in real life. And that was really cool at that point, because I don't think that had been done in a similar way before. And I actually, now that I'm saying all this, I did not look to see if there were follow-up studies or if this was, kind of applied to larger groupings, applied to more people. I'm not sure what
more
was done
text,
afterwards.
sure.
Right. But the fact that this study exists is a really, really fascinating bridge between some of the content analysis you were looking at in the humanities work and some of the, some of the neuroscience, some of the other social science work that exists in the other social sciences. And basically what I get from all of this work is that the researchers who grew up with Harry Potter are really interested in both excavating what exists within the texts themselves and applying them to the real world and seeing what sort of effects they have on their readers and on wider society.
I agree. I think that's, oh man. I mean, it's great to live in a time when we are far enough along from the publication of these books that we have such a great case study for the impact of literature on large groups of people.
Yes.
I mean, before Harry Potter, who would you have looked at? Would you have looked at the Hardy Boys? Maybe. But it wouldn't have been read as widely. I don't think, the research itself wouldn't have been as widely read. These days, people are going back, they're actively interrogating it, they're building on each other's work, they're responding to each other's work. All of these are scholarly publications that are quoting the shit out of each other, and it's glorious, and it's brilliant, and I love it. Thank you, 2018, for having one good thing in you. But yeah, let's go back to that question I had. I want to hear your thoughts. Because Harry Potter has been criticized in the past for opening up a lot of questions about the other, about the various minority populations of the Harry Potter universe that then it doesn't really deliver on in the original series. Yeah. When you look at the prequel series, and I can talk about the play, because I have read the...
I have not. I can't talk about it at all. Other than I think it's a pile of steaming garbage, but whatever.
I have read the script version or the printed version of The Cursed Child, and I have listened to the soundtrack, which has scores by Imogen Heap, which is hilarious.
That is delightful. Yeah.
Okay, so talk about the prequels.
So let's talk about the prequels a little bit. So the prequels have been dogged by controversy after controversy. I'm Sean Connery now. By controversy after controversy, because essentially what's happening is that I think actually that J.K. Rowling is an awesome person. That she is, when she wrote the Potter books back, when she started coming up with them in the 80s and 90s, because they go back, obviously, a while before the first book was published. She cared deeply about showcasing the kind of characters, the kind of struggles that didn't necessarily make it to the forefront of a lot of books. Certainly, they did make it into plenty of books. Again, I don't think Harry Potter is unique in that regard, but showing for kids, for example, Hermione and how she advocates on behalf of the house elves who are essentially enslaved is something that received a lot of time in the books, got completely removed from the movies, but that's, another problem, but was obviously, to me, indicative of what J.K. Rowling was really trying to instill in her readers. This, kind of what that study showed, that there could be this change in empathy towards others, especially towards marginalized groups, if you approach them in the right way. Okay, so that's all wonderful. Great. Skip ahead to now. Okay. The problem is that J.K. Rowling, that the works themselves get older. And we've talked about, I think, especially in our podcast about problematic favorites, how sometimes works that were not problematic originally age into being problematic simply because tastes, cultures, societies are shifting around them. So in the case of Harry Potter, there's very little representation of people of color. There's no representation of anyone who's LGBTQ+. Like, we got after the fact that Dumbledore was gay, but that was it. And so, sort of a more modern reading of Harry Potter, you might want to know, given that, the exciting directions that fantasies have gone in, that YA literature has gone in, in the 90s and early 2000s, were there trans kids at Hogwarts? How many students of color were there? Like, and these are the kinds of questions that, if we just look back at the books, they're not there. They can't be answered. But the prequels give more opportunities for things to be shoehorned into the world. So we get revelations like that Nagini, who we see as a snake, as Voldemort's snake, was actually a person, and she was a person of color, in the prequels. And
that's problematic.
Right, and it's kind of like...
evil person, the only person of color.
Exactly. So they're trying to, gesture at this representation within the series, but they're also making a person of color literally into a pet who then gets her head sliced off.
Like, she's either a slave or actively evil. Both are really, really problematic.
Right. And then, of course, there's the repeated furor over, now that we have a younger Dumbledore as, a main character, it's apparently not really acknowledged that he's gay in the new film. It certainly wasn't in the first, because he wasn't there. There's the furor over the keeping of Johnny Depp as the main antagonist when he has...
As someone who is...
yes. Well, that says it all. Right, yep. So, and these are the sorts of things that even when the books were coming out, even when the movies based on the Harry Potter books were coming out, the fandom was still growing up, essentially. But you have... basically, these things don't fly anymore. And so I think that the series, as, reborn through the prequels, is, as a really long way of answering your question, trying to grapple with some of these things, but trying to grapple with them in an almost, mid-90s kind of way. You can't just... In 2018, even though things are shitty in a lot of ways, you can't just stick a person of color into the book as an established character who, again, was a pet and gets her head cut off, and expect that to be okay. And everyone's like, oh, but you tried to get more people of color in there. It's just, that's not how people are going to react to that. And they didn't. And that's something that I think the series has really kind of found... it has been really polarizing for the series, because obviously we both had the same reaction where it's that is not okay, that's really shitty. But will the series continue to make boatloads of money? Yes. But also, the point of Harry Potter, I think a lot of people will say, especially people who grew up with it, who came to it, for whom it was an important part of their childhoods and beyond, that in the same way that, for example, I treat Star Trek as this really important ideological piece of science fiction, and not just about, how many alien ships can you blow up? Harry Potter is very much about, these characters who care for each other. This world that is imperfect, and they try and fix its imperfections, because a lot of the imperfections treat the other as less than, and they're trying to get around that. And so if a work in which you consistently see that ignored, where the people of color are snakes, where the gays get erased, where, people like Johnny Depp are main characters, that's just not gonna fly with the message of Harry Potter, I think is where a lot of people come down on it.
Right, and I think that this is a case where we are actually feeling the effects of the fandom discontinuity that was talked about in that one article, where we are looking at what the text is trying to say, and we're noting the inconsistencies, and we're calling for Rowling and the other people involved in the crafting of these stories to do better. And I think that a lot of the beats that you noted in the prequel are hit on again in Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, which happens, after the Harry Potter series. It's a sequel. And one thing that they did that I thought was really cool is Hermione was cast as a person of color, and they just didn't comment on it. That was just the reality. I'm not sure who all was involved in the making of that decision, but that was a good one. It's something I wish and hope that they do in future. I'm assuming that there's going to be future film franchises and whatnot around Harry Potter, because why would you stop making a good thing if you could, or a money-making thing if you could? I hope that that's a decision they continue to make. However, they queer-baited like nobody else's business. So they took Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy. They gave them this great, male friendship, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And you actually had it expressed within the text that that Scorpius was jealous of Albus's crush on someone else. So you had that stated in the text. However, then by the end of the play, you have Scorpius trying to start a relationship with a girl. And so you had this sudden shift away from the male friendship relationship towards something that's heteronormative. And that was really disappointing for fans. It was really disappointing for me when I read it. And that is another case in which I felt justified in my fanon discontinuity.
Yeah.
And I think that what I loved about Goodman's article, Disappointing Fans, Fandom, the Fictional Theory, and the Death of the Author, is that it allows for this feeling to exist and to have reasons to exist. It's not just a case of like, oh, fans are giving me such a hard time about a thing that I did. The text is the text. Accept it and move on. And I think that there's this tension in our culture right now between the people who write fan fiction and the people who make fun of fan fiction. And like, I think that there's a role and a place for people to be dissatisfied with the text that they love for doing things wrong on certain things. Yeah. And so, like, I think it's okay to be like, J.K. Rowling, you can do better. And also, I love your book, at the same time, And your book is important, and it will always be important. However, let's not be content with, pursuing continuity at the expense of positive change.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I agree.
Of course, I'm an activist, so take that how you will.
Yeah, right. It's hard to kind of say, because I mean, I know that Harry Potter is so widespread, so widely read, that everyone who feels strongly about it is not going to have these feelings. And as much as I would like to say, like, no, these are the right feelings to have about it, like, the plain truth is that not everyone feels that way. But we've come a long way in the generation since Harry Potter was published, since Harry Potter was beginning to be published. Basically, if you were born in 97, when the first Harry Potter book came out, you are now able to drink in the U.S. In other places, you could have had a drink for many years.
No, don't tell me that, Tony. I'm not ready.
I know, I
am not ready to be that old.
But Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone itself could sit down at any bar in the United States and order itself a drink. And that is the sort of thing that really, it makes you... I don't say that only to make both of us feel old, but rather to say that its time has passed in a lot of different ways. It has become an important part of our experiences, like we shared at the top of the hour. It has become now, for folks who are our age and having their own kids, a part of those kids' experiences, and everyone in between as well. And the sort of legacy it leaves could easily be one similar to that article in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology that I said, that I cited, where the greatest magic of Harry Potter really is reducing prejudice. It could also be that the legacy turns into a kind of cash cow where Harry Potter is slapped onto anything that can hold the name and make a lot of money, and its legacy is no longer this kind of like social justice, ensuring equity, long-term legacy that we the two of us, and I'm sure a lot more people associate with it.
Right.
And it's certainly not an either or either. Like, I think that the reality is it's some of both for lots of people.
Well, and I think it's in a sense, it's in good company, because there's quite a few franchises now that are at the point where they're having to ask tough questions about what they want their legacy to be. And I'm thinking specifically of Star Wars here, because this is another series that, you know, was a big part of our generation's childhood that now is being rebooted and rewritten. Yeah. The canon of the books was just completely wiped clean when it was purchased by Disney, and now they're writing a new series canon. And actually, I think that Star Wars is a great comparison, because what they've tried to do is diversify their approach. Yeah. Every book, it seems like, is written by a different author, including authors of color, authors who are queer, authors who are, you know, coming from other backgrounds than those which contributed to the original series. And the movies, especially the sequel series, because there's also the interquels that are happening now, but like mostly the sequels I'm interested in, because they've really focused on diversifying and changing up the narrative a bit to comment on and respond to current concerns and current activism. So you have hopefully what's not going to be queer baiting, but an actual legitimate queer relationship developing on screen. You've got characters of color from multiple, I mean, I'm getting emotional thinking about it. Characters representing cultures and what readers and watchers who've never seen themselves in the Star Wars universe before. And I think that that's a lesson that Harry Potter, the prequel movies, anything that comes after this can really learn from. I mean, Star Wars is not perfect still, but it seems to be listening to the fans without going too far. You know, like not doing the fan service thing that we all hate. But actually, I mean, isn't it ironic that, like, fan service is the thing that's hated by some fans? I think that's hilarious. But I think that they've struck a neat balance where they're making progress. They're demonstrating that they care about what their watchers and readers actually think and want. And I just think that's so neat. So, like, shout out to you, Star Wars. Thank you for providing us with at least one template for a better future.
Well, I think that we could literally talk about Harry Potter for hours. But seeing as we're staring down the hour mark at the time that I'm saying this, I think it's time we leave our beloved boy wizard for now.
May he rest in peace.
May he rest in his cupboard.
May he rest in his... Okay. Anyway, so we are going to be releasing this episode shortly after Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Oh, as an outro, you know, what are you thankful for this Thanksgiving that relates to...
Well, I'm actually gonna build a little excitement here and say that I have a plan for my personal Twitter account. I'm going to be releasing... This sounds so exciting. I have like 60 Twitter followers. But I'm going to be doing something about my favorite authors on Twitter in December. Sort of as a cool way to end 2018. You know, it's going to be basically a tribute to the 30-ish authors who have made huge impacts on me as a reader and as a writer. And those posts are going to be thankful for each of those people. So I'm going to say, check out my Twitter.
Wow, and that handle is?
Deviants_engine.
Nice. That sounds really neat. So what kind of spurred this?
I was going through one of my shelves and picking out a couple of books, because we're leaving for Thanksgiving, and I like to, when I travel, I like to read books that I've already read. So I was looking through them and sort of saying, like, well, what am I going to read now? And I just happened upon a couple that I had signed at different events, and I was just looking at them and being like, I know when I go up to those authors that they're tired, that, you know, they've been doing it for a while. In a lot of cases, they've just given a reading. They've flown out to be there. They've driven out to be there. And they're like, you know, they sign a bunch of books. And yet it's still like, a lot of the times, the best ones, the best authors will give you the sense that, like, no, I actually want you to have this. Like, there'll be, you know, a little spark of connection a lot of the time. And then when I go back and look at those, even though in most of those cases it's been years and years, I really, you know, I look at that signature and the little message that comes with it, and I'm like, I had a connection with this person. And then it kind of, like, went beyond that to, like, a lot of my favorite authors I've never met, I've never, you know, seen in person, and maybe never will. Some of them are dead. But, you know, who are they to me? They're really important to me, and especially if they're still alive, but even if they're not, like, I think it would be cool to just kind of do, you know, a kind of appreciation for what they've done, for what they put out in the world.
I love that. Thanks for giving me a higher bar to reach for in terms of my own life goals. Oh, wow. Great.
So yeah, that's my post-Thanksgiving thankfulness thing. What are you thankful for this Thanksgiving?
First of all, I'm approaching my finals, assuming that I pass all of my finals. And so I will be finished with my library science degree in early December.
Yes.
And I'm thankful for that for multiple reasons. In part because it frees me up to tackle the next big project I want to work on, which is the Imaginary Awards for 2018. I'm really excited about those. We've got lots of great texts. We already talked about kind of the midway point books that we've read. I'm also really excited because I just got into the She-Ra reboot series on Netflix, and it's just so full of joy and positivity and queer representation. I really highly recommend it for anyone who liked Steven Universe.
Yeah.
And there's a couple other, you know, series that I'm sure people could transition from. I know some of the reviews of it were not entirely positive. A lot of people were like, oh, it's derivative or it's redundant. It's repeating things that Steven Universe has done. And I say to those people, you know what? We could do with more of that stuff in the world. And we do not get to say when a genre is over, when a style is over, just because we've seen ourselves represented. So watch She-Ra. It's great. Anyway,
You're
that's
right.
Another thing that I'm really excited about and really thankful for. So yeah, it's been an interesting year with a lot of ups and downs. I'm currently recovering, well, hopefully recovering. My fever just spiked. I'm recovering, telling myself I'm recovering from being under the weather. So there's a lot in the future to look forward to that right now I'm like hanging on to, get me through this shit.
Yeah.
You know how that goes. Anyway.
Yep.
So, but we're also thankful for you, our listeners.
We are very much.
So how do we wrap up our show, Tony?
Well, we say thank you for listening. And as always, you can find us wherever you download your podcasts. If you want to listen to us on the interwebs, we're on YouTube, all of our back episodes, SoundCloud, about 10 to 15. No, iTunes has like 10 to 15. SoundCloud has like 10. But basically anything we put out over the past 6 months, you're going to find on SoundCloud and iTunes and YouTube and wherever you download your podcast. So check those out. Our website is imaginaries.net, and we're on Twitter as the podcast at imaginary_pod.
Yes. And we hope to be more active there in the near future as we both approach the end of our academic school year. You're teaching, you're doing your thesis. I'm, finishing up my finals. So yeah, we will be more active there in the future. So look for more of us on all of those platforms. We're looking forward to hanging 10 with you guys virtually. Yeah. You know how it goes. So
That's right.
Tony.
That's right.
Tony.
Yeah.
You're awesome.
Oh, thanks. You're awesome. Oh.
And
bye.